Howdy, and welcome to our podcast. This is Knox.
And Rafael Fernandez.
And Jaclyn Garza.
So in this story, we have a protagonist named Lee who was studying Calculus 2 at the Zachary Engineering Building with a group of his friends. They were all discussing materials from class when another group of students came by the same study area that Lee was in. In the second group, students from all races and majors were present, while Lee's group was homoculturally segregated, consisting of all Vietnamese students studying engineering. As the second group of students ran into Lee's group, he recognized a boy in the other group named Xian. Lee and Xian actually went to the same middle school but haven't had contact with each other since. It was only then that Lee noticed that Xian seemed to have trouble studying. When Lee went to Xian to ask what he was studying about, he noticed it was Psychology 107 with Dr. Hall. Lee then snarked and asked, "Are you having trouble with that?" To which Xian actually responded that he indeed was. Lee immediately got his other group of Vietnamese friends to harass Xian, calling him derogatory terms such as fake Asian and disgrace to the culture. This is because the stereotype that has been implemented across the world that Asians, including Vietnamese, are smart STEM students. When they asked Xian about his major, he responded that he was a sociology major, and Lee asked, "Liberal arts, what's wrong with you? You bring disgrace to your family and to you, Xian," causing Xian to hyperventilate, swim from his armpits and forehead, redirecting blood flow to his major organs through a process known as the fight or flight response. The human brain switches on to the circulatory system that analyzes a threat level to avoid the animal or harm. That's a quote from Smithsonian 2007. Xian's friend Emily saw what was happening to him while studying Psychology 107's Core 1 project herself. She focused on the situation, wanting to intervene and not wanting to insult herself. "These boys are making fun of Asians for not being smart. I wonder what they will think of me." As Emily watched Xian's situation escalate, she started to experience fear and anxiety, which are evolutionary developed responses to a perceived or anticipated threat. These responses are normal, and they put into place to protect ourselves from any potential threat, but when anxiety or fear are left unchecked, they could possibly impact day-to-day life.
Emily looked down at her psychology assignment, noticed the article Mind Over Matter in her pile of papers, and read that when people believe they possess sufficient resources to cope with stressors, they experience a challenge response. But when situational demands are seen as exceeding resources, individuals experience threat. So while having sweat dribble down her own forehead, a dry mouth, shaky legs, she decided that in the situation at hand, she did not have enough resources to cope with this scenario. Thus, she stood up and confronted Lee, the leader of the group. Emily knew she needed to be an ally for Xian. Being the strong ally she was, initially going to provoke the situation more by calling Lee and his friends a racist and other degrading terms back, but instead she then recalled from her Psych 107 course that regardless of the circumstances, bystanders should avoid calling a perpetrator racist or otherwise attacking their character, which tend to trigger defensive and diminish the rapport that leads to growth and understanding. Instead of following the same article's suggestion, she chose to target the behavior, not the person. Additionally, Emily needed to speak for herself, not for Xian. She needed to speak on how insulting this display was to her and how it does not coincide for what she stands for. She began by simply asking Lee, "Why do you do this?" To which Lee responded that this was none of her business. She once again asked, "Why do you do this?" When Lee responded by saying that he was insulted that a fellow Asian would be so stupid as to not understand psychology, Emily responded by asking, "Well, have you taken this class before?" Lee responded that he had not, since it was not in the course degree plan. Emily invited Lee and his friends to join their group in their studies, to which they agreed, claiming it would be easy. They then were humbled by the items being taught and realized that race did not matter in SMART. Rather, it is about commitment, and by studying, Xian was committed to his grade. Xian and Emily not only scored an A later on the exam, but also showed Lee and his group some great basics of psychology and introduced the idea that intelligence does not matter to race, rather your commitment to school and the material at hand.
In this scenario, after Emily hears what is occurring, she sits out since she's not Asian. How does this racism affect me? Emily prefers a maladaptive threat. These negative appraisals encourage people to perceive demands as exceeding resources. She decides to stay back and see Xian feed into the terms that the boys were saying by fighting back with lines such as, "I want to go to graduate school," and "I'm going to get a PhD." Only feeding fuel to the fire, causing the boys to believe this perception of Asians being better at school to be unbalanced even more. Eventually, after the boys got bored and left Xian alone, he came back and told Emily that he needed to leave for undisclosed reasons. Later that week, he switched his major to engineering to prove to others that he is a real Asian that's good at school. This hurts Emily since her friend had caved into the fake perception that race correlates with grades, and she now had to study alone.
What we learned from this is that Emily should fight the racial stereotypes and be an ally to her friend. This teaches other students that intelligence does not come from race. Thanks, Gig'em, and here are our sources.